The lights flickered, dimmed, and then died. Across the eastern seaboard, from the bustling streets of New York City to the quiet suburbs of Maine, millions were plunged into darkness. It wasn't a terrorist attack, a natural disaster, or a cyber attack. It was something far more unsettling, an energy crisis of unprecedented proportions. At gas stations, lines stretched for blocks, the air thick with frustration and the stench of gasoline. Prices on the digital signs climbed higher by the minute, a stark reminder of the nation's sudden vulnerability. Supermarkets rationed essential goods as panicked shoppers emptied shelves, fearing the worst was yet to come. The cause of this chaos? A terse announcement from Ottawa that sent shockwaves across the continent. Canada, America's closest ally and largest energy supplier, had cut off all exports of oil, natural gas, and electricity to the United States. The Great White North, long considered a reliable and amicable neighbor, had taken a stand, leaving the United States to grapple with the crippling reality of its energy dependence. In the blink of an eye, the American way of life, built on the bedrock of cheap and abundant energy, was thrown into disarray. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a national emergency. The American economy, heavily reliant on Canadian energy, ground to a halt. Factories fell silent. Supply chains buckled. The cost of living skyrocketed, pushing millions further into poverty. The American dream, once a beacon of hope for so many, seemed to flicker and fade along with the lights. For over a century, the United States and Canada enjoyed a symbiotic, if often unequal, energy relationship. Canada, blessed with vast reserves of oil, natural gas, and hydropower, became the energy reservoir for its southern neighbor. The United States, with its insatiable appetite for energy, readily tapped into this abundant source, fueling its industrial growth and consumerism. Pipelines crisscrossed the border, carrying millions of barrels of oil and cubic feet of natural gas southward. High-voltage power lines hummed with electricity generated by Canada's mighty rivers, keeping American homes lit and factories running. This energy flow, seemingly as constant as the Niagara Falls, fostered a sense of complacency, a belief that Canada would always be there to fuel the American engine. However, beneath the surface of this energy partnership, tensions simmered. Canada's reliance on the U.S. market left it vulnerable to price fluctuations and political whims. American policymakers, often taking Canada's energy abundance for granted, pursued policies that benefited their domestic industries, sometimes at the expense of their northern neighbor. The seeds of resentment were sown, waiting for the right moment to sprout, and that moment arrived with a series of economic and political decisions made in Washington, decisions that would shatter the illusion of an unbreakable bond. The decision to sever energy ties with the United States was not taken lightly in Ottawa. It was a calculated gamble, a bold move born out of years of mounting frustration and a shifting geopolitical landscape. Protectionist trade policies enacted by the United States, policies that targeted Canadian industries with punitive tariffs. The message was clear: America first, even at the expense of its oldest ally. Canada, off guard by this aggressive stance, chose not to back down. Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, known for her steely resolve and sharp intellect, recognized that Canada's dependence on the U.S. market had become a strategic liability. Freeland embarked on a mission to diversify Canada's economic and energy partnerships, forging new alliances with eager partners in Asia and Europe. Long-term contracts were signed, pipelines were rerouted, laden with Canadian energy sailed for distant shores. The message to Washington was unmistakable. Canada was no longer content to be an energy vassal, beholden to the whims of its southern neighbor. It was one that prioritized its own economic security and strategic autonomy. The immediate impact of Canada's decision was swift and brutal. The United States, accustomed to an uninterrupted flow of cheap energy, was woefully unprepared for the sudden cutoff. Gas prices soared to unimaginable heights, exceeding $10 per gallon in some areas. The cost of heating homes and businesses became exorbitant, forcing families to choose between warmth and food. The transportation sector ground to a halt as trucking companies struggled to fill their tanks, leading to empty shelves in supermarkets and skyrocketing food prices. The industrial heartland, reliant on Canadian energy to power its factories, fell silent. Assembly lines stopped, furnaces went cold, and millions of workers were laid off. The unemployment rate skyrocketed, pushing the economy into a deep recession. The American dream, built on the promise of upward mobility and prosperity, was revealed to be a house of cards, precariously balanced on the foundation of cheap energy. With that foundation shattered, the American way of life was thrown into turmoil. Section 5. A New World Order Energy Geopolitics in Flux. As the United States grappled with the harsh realities of its energy crisis, the rest of the world watched with a mixture of concern and opportunity. The global energy market, once dominated by the petrodollar and American influence, was undergoing a seismic shift. Europe, long wary of its dependence on Russian energy, saw an opportunity to diversify its supplies. Canada, eager to strengthen ties with its transatlantic allies, stepped in to fill the void, signing long-term contracts to provide natural gas and oil to European markets. China and India, with their burgeoning economies and growing energy demands, welcomed Canada's pivot eastward. Multi-billion-dollar deals were struck, securing a steady flow of Canadian energy to fuel their industrial ambitions. The United States, once the undisputed leader in the global energy market, found itself increasingly isolated, its influence waning as other nations forged new partnerships and secured their energy future. The era of American energy dominance was over, replaced by a multipolar world where energy security trumped old alliances. Section 6. The Long Road Ahead. America's Uncertain Energy Future. Faced with this unprecedented crisis, the United States scrambled to find alternative sources of energy and reduce its dependence on its northern neighbor. But the path to energy independence was fraught with challenges, both immediate and long-term. Domestic oil and gas production, while significant, couldn't compensate for the sudden loss of Canadian imports. Many U.S. refineries designed to process Canadian heavy crude faced costly and time-consuming retooling to handle oil from other sources. Renewable energy sources, while promising, couldn't fill the gap in the short term. The transition to a clean energy future required massive investments in infrastructure, research, and development, a process that would take years, if not decades, to bear fruit. The political will to make such investments was also lacking. The American public, long accustomed to cheap energy, was resistant to the higher costs and potential lifestyle changes associated with a transition to renewable energy. The United States, once a beacon of innovation and self-reliance, found itself at a crossroads, forced to confront the consequences of its energy choices and chart a new course for the future. Section 7. A Bridge Too Far? The Future of U.S. Canada Relations. The energy crisis sent shockwaves through the U.S. Canada relationship, a partnership once considered among the closest and most stable in the world. The sudden severing of energy ties exposed the underlying tensions and vulnerabilities that had been festering beneath the surface for years. Canada, emboldened by its newfound economic leverage and strategic partnerships, adopted a more assertive stance on the world stage, no longer willing to play the role of junior partner to its southern neighbor. The United States, struggling to cope with the fallout of its own policies, found itself increasingly isolated, its influence diminished. The long-term implications of this rift were profound. The North American continent, once a symbol of economic integration and shared values, was becoming increasingly divided. The dream of a North American Union, once touted as a natural evolution of the U.S. Canada relationship, now seemed like a distant and improbable fantasy. The future of the U.S. Canada relationship remained uncertain, clouded by mistrust, resentment, and the specter of a world in which energy security trumped old alliances. Section 8. A Crisis of Our Own Making, a Call for American Resilience. The energy crisis that gripped the United States was not merely a result of Canada's actions, it was a crisis of America's own making. Years of short-sighted policies, a reliance on fossil fuels, and a failure to invest in renewable energy had left the nation vulnerable to the whims of foreign powers. But this crisis, however painful, also presented an opportunity for reflection and renewal. It was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that the American way of life, built on the bedrock of cheap and abundant energy, was unsustainable. The United States needed to wean itself off its addiction to fossil fuels and embrace a clean energy future. It needed to invest in renewable energy sources, energy efficiency, and smart grid technologies. It needed to reduce its energy consumption and find ways to do more with less. This was not just an environmental imperative, it was an economic and national security imperative. The United States could no longer afford to be held hostage to the whims of foreign energy suppliers. It was time for America to reclaim its energy independence and chart a new course for the 21st century. The road ahead would be challenging, but the American spirit, forged in the crucible of past crises, was up to the task. The energy crisis, for all its pain and disruption, could yet prove to be the catalyst for a cleaner, more sustainable, and ultimately more prosperous future for the United States.